Richard Bair is a VP of software engineering at Swirlds Labs, aka Hashgraph now, which is great. And previously held positions at Oracle and Sun Microsystems, obviously before getting acquired by Oracle. And he first started at Hedera back in 2021. And over the years, Richard has seen some pretty important products and changes in our ecosystem. And most recently, like we were just talking about, he's become an initial member of the Hyro Technical Steering Committee and helped lead the initiative. So welcome to the show, Richard. It's so great to have you, and I hope you're doing well. Let me know if I left anything out of your intro.
Yeah, you're good. Thanks, Brandon. I'm glad to be here. I guess my audio and everything's working. Hopefully it's all good.
We're all good. Sounds great.
I was going to have that same cup. I forgot it in the kitchen because I was like, Brandon is always drinking from something.
Yeah.
And so I was like, I was going to bring my cup. But I'm glad to be here. I think, I have in my Twitter handle, right, there's something a little bit about me and then like deeply uncomfortable with tweeting.
Yeah.
I think developer presentations, I'm very happy with those. Those are really good. But having an actual sort of online media presence, not something that we have, the engineers on our team are typically
right,
very outgoing on. But I would love to change that. And so any other future opportunities have to come on would be great.
Yeah, open door always. And I think that's definitely been a big topic for people in the ecosystem and a big conversation in the community around marketing and changes needed at Hedera. And to be honest with you, it was very refreshing to see someone that, isn't a marketing person, but is the person actually building and managing these initiatives out front on social media, like answering questions in real time. And I think that the results of that is like less confusion, more people getting behind this. So I think that in the past, I think that a big announcement or a launch like this might not have been so impactful, but because of that tweak, like you guys should definitely be doing more of that. And I think that this was like fantastic.
Yeah, it definitely feels good.
Yeah.
It's nice to be involved. And I think that's actually one of the main reasons for Hyro really is to deepen that engagement at the technical level. I mean, I'll admit, I've got a little Ethereum envy. I watch how their development teams are building things, and they have their all core devs call, for example, that anybody can watch, anybody can see what's coming. They have their meetings where they decide what goes into the next releases. All that kind of stuff is done in a very open, collaborative way. And we really wanted to have a similar sort of a vibe going on inside Hedera Hashgraph. Hedera Hashgraph inside our network. So. That was one of the motivators for Hyro was like, we need proper open source governance that will allow anybody anywhere to participate. You don't have to be an employee at Hashgraph. You don't have to be an employee with LimeChain. You don't have to be but anybody anywhere should be able to participate. And it's all just based on pure open source principles, proper meritocracy. You have good code changes, then come on in, including, as Lehman mentioned at the launch announcement in Vienna, all the way up to leadership in the Hyro open source project.
100%. I love that. And so maybe we can kind of pull back a bit for folks maybe unfamiliar with some of the different layers to this. And maybe could you just give a brief overview of like the Linux Foundation's Decentralized Trust? What's the purpose of it? What is Hedera's relationship to it? It seems like there's so many like important brands and organizations involved. So maybe you can just kind of paint that picture for us.
Yeah, you bet. So, of course, open source goes back a long time. And initially, it was all just about making the source open and picking a good license.
Right. These
days, that's trivial. Everybody can do it. You just pick an Apache 2 license or an MIT license. Everybody loves you and they'll use your project. And we've done that. So we use the Apache 2 license for all of our code. It's all open source. Life is good. But that's really not enough. That's just like the starting point. That just allows people to see into the code and see what's going on. But, if we were bad people, what we could do is we could take all of our open source code and make it closed source and do additional development on it. Yes, whatever version of the open source code that you have available, you could use, you could build on, you could do what you wanted with. But, we own the Hashgraph organization on GitHub, we could just make it private and nobody would have access to the code anymore.
Right.
That would be kind of lame. The nice thing about these open source foundations like Linux Foundation is that they own that code. They own that repo. And their whole reason for existence is to provide a vendor neutral home for code development. So if we were to look at the Linux Foundation, its purpose is to be a vendor neutral home. They don't tell us how to build our code. They don't tell us, well, they really, I don't know. Yeah, they don't tell us how to build our code. They don't give us the technical direction. They don't give us business direction. They don't give us any of that. But what they do is they provide a vendor neutral home. And if we, for example, became evil and started to exert vendor specific control over that organization, over that, over Hyro, then Linux Foundation is a trusted person that everybody can look to and say, hey, Linux Foundation, look at these guys at Hyro. They're all behaving really badly. Linux Foundation can come in and say, okay, you guys are all off.
Right.
But it's not something that they've ever done or ever would do in the real world. It's one of those things where when you create the proper incentives, everybody behaves correctly. And that's why we go into an open foundation like this. Mm-hmm. It gives trust. People have trust. And if you looked at the big companies like Oracle, you mentioned, I was at Sun Microsystems and I was at Oracle for a long time. At Oracle, they have an open source program office. If you are somewhere, one of those 50,000 engineers somewhere inside Oracle, and you say, oh, this is a great project, I would like to contribute to it. Or this is a great project, I would like to use it to help build my product. You've got to go get approval for that from some central program office.
Right.
Now, if you go to that central program office and you say, hey, I would like to use this open source project, they say, well, who's running it? Now, I don't know, it's just some random company out here called, they're a Hashgraph. Then, they have a whole process that they have to go through in order to do that. And most engineers try to avoid that level of work, right? It's like, forget it. I'll just
more paperwork,
or I'll just do something else. By being part of a trusted organization like the Linux Foundation, these other big, entities, they already have accepted Linux Foundation. They're already members of the Linux Foundation. In order to contribute code and everything, the bar is way lower. And so we wanted to be in a place where there would be, number one, instant recognition by everybody that we really are open source. Because as you know, we open sourced this stuff completely a couple years ago, but there's still a lot of people who would say, oh, Hedera is not open source, it's proprietary.
Right.
And so we wanted to sort of put the nail in the coffin on that one and say, we are part of the Linux Foundation. You can't say that we're not open source now.
Yeah.
And we also wanted to make it really easy for anybody to be able to contribute to it. And we also wanted to increase the level of trust that people have that the open source project is going to be run in a proper open source way.
Gotcha.
Now, within the Linux Foundation, they have a ton of different projects. There's the CNCF, Cloud Native Compute Foundation, which is where Kubernetes lives. If anybody knows Kubernetes, all that whole ecosystem is massive, and it's in there. Of course, Linux itself, Linux kernel, is part of the Linux Foundation. Even the, I think it's OpenJS is the name of it, which is actually the foundation that manages Node.js, is also part of the Linux Foundation. So that there's a lot of actually really critical code that everybody is using and relies on that's done by the Linux Foundation. Inside the Linux Foundation, they had Hyperledger. And Hyperledger was kind of like there was Hyperledger Besu, which we use for our EVM implementation. But there was also Hyperledger Fabric, which was, and Hyperledger was just like an overarching brand name for all these things, even though they really didn't have a whole lot in common with each other. Hyperledger Fabric was like an Ethereum client that you could use for private Ethereum networks. And they decided to rebrand themselves as the Decentralized Trust, Linux Foundation Decentralized Trust, and broaden out the sort of projects that could be part of that. So we joined the LFDT, Linux Foundation Decentralized Trust, and as one of the founding members, meaning that at the moment that they did the announcement, we were there.
Right.
And also, Hedera has joined the governing board of the Linux Foundation Decentralized Trust.
Okay.
So inside the Linux Foundation, you can join it and pay dues. And if you pay those dues, a portion of that money goes to this governing board, and they get to spend it on things like marketing, events, and stuff like that. So then underneath the Linux Foundation Decentralized Trust, we have the Hyro project, which is everything Hedera. And then underneath that, we have a whole bunch of sub-projects like the consensus node, docs, HIP repo, one of my favorite PBJ, mirror node, all these kinds of things will be projects underneath Hyro. So
Gotcha.
that's how it's organized.
That's great. So basically what you're saying is the relationship that Hedera has to the Linux Foundation's Decentralized Trust is really about moving the source code of Hedera to something that is more like decentrally managed, that isn't so gate kept. So as you said, if Hedera turned evil, the network and the code base wouldn't be as affected. And also too, what you're saying is, because these boxes have been checked from a corporate or organizational standpoint, a lot of the magic that's going to have to happen to get this enterprise adoption is going to start with someone with a really cool idea in the CTO's office at some company that wants to tinker with something and move something to production. And right now there can be a lot of checks and balances and paperwork and red tape to make that happen, which is just really discouraging. And they're like, well, I'll just pick up something else. But now this moves Hedera in the form of Hyro into a position where that individual that's going to have the breakthrough idea at some organization can start tinkering now with this much more easily.
Yeah, exactly. So I'll give you like an example from my own life. At Oracle, one of the roles that I had was as an architect on our IoT platforms that we had at Oracle, or they have. And one of them was a supply chain management tool. And supply chain management is one of the core businesses that Oracle's in. And we wanted to build it on a blockchain. And so, of course, we chose Hyperledger Fabric. Was it fast? No. Was it cheap? No. I mean, I'm not trying to throw shade on those.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that there were challenges. As a Hedera guy, it'd be awesome if I'd be able to say, yeah, we can use Hedera. But getting approval for that sort of thing is really difficult, especially at the time when not all the code had been open sourced. It was like, yeah, that was never going to happen.
Right.
But now, and being part of the LFDT sort of opens up those sorts of doors that weren't available before.
That's okay. That's really cool to hear. And definitely, it gets me excited for, again, like I think a lot of that magic is going to happen with those individuals at these organizations. So that's great. And then, so we've got a good idea of kind of what Hyro is and Hedera's kind of position in this new kind of entity. And now we start to talk about the past, the future, what this means. And I think a really great place to start is from a community question that I think it was funny. You responded to and was like, I'm just going to talk about this on Brandon's show. But the community question was, what influence does the Hedera Governing Council hold over this Hyro project? Would the goals and incentives of Hedera and Hyro ever be misaligned? And kind of like, how does this change or not change the Hedera Governing Council?
Yeah, I think this is a really fundamental question. And it's one that we spent a long time on before making this move. So to provide a little bit of context, this idea of going to a foundation is something that we've discussed at the board level, the GC level, for a long time. And one of the things that was very central to the decision-making process was, what is the relationship between Hedera and Hyro? Of course, we didn't have a name for it at the time, but what's the relationship between these things? Concern was, are we handing over control of the Hedera network to, whoever happens to be writing the source code?
Right.
Do we trust them? Where's the trust model? How does this whole thing work? So I think that the way that I think about this is that Hyro is where we develop the source code. Today, it's the Hashgraph team and the people that we work with develop that source code.
Mm-hmm.
If you were to look at the maintainers on the consensus node software, for example, it's like all these people from Hashgraph, formerly Swirlds Labs, formerly Hedera. Those are the ones who are there, right? And So if you were to look at the relationship between the two things, you'd say Hyro is the place where the source code is developed. Hedera is a deployment of that source code.
Okay.
And Hedera needs to maintain control over what source code is actually deployed to their network. And
gotcha. There's a level of separation to that in a way.
Yeah. And so like Hedera has a seat on the technical steering committee. The technical steering committee is made up of 9 individuals, with no more than 2 of them from any one company.
Okay.
There's a whole legal language that defines exactly what that means, and Lehman is an exception. So Lehman sort of represents himself. He has a permanent seat on the TSC. Hedera has a seat on the TSC for the first 3 years, and then after that, their seat goes into being a normal one that gets elected. Then there are maintainer seats. Basically, the maintainers of the different projects inside Hyro can elect people to sit on the technical steering committee. Then there is a seat for any contributor. So even if you're not a maintainer or a committer, but you have contributed source code, documentation, or something like that to the projects, you'll be eligible to vote for the contributor seat. You elect somebody to sit as a contributor. And there's also an end user seat, which is for anybody who's, I'd say like the Karate Combats and the Atmas and those sorts of people in the world. Anybody who's using this product to build their businesses, they would be eligible to vote for a member that sits on the TSC. And then there's a couple seats that are filled by all the other people vote and elect a couple more people to fill it out. So there's like this whole decentralized rule set for who can sit on the technical steering committee. And critically, no more than 2 from any one company. Lehman representing himself and not Hashgraph. And that means that we're going to have a whole bunch of people there. It's not going to be the same faces that we've always seen. And I personally am hoping that there's going to be a lot, I have certain people that I hope end up getting elected to these positions.
Nice.
But, that are totally outside of, the normal set. I'm really bullish on that. I think that it would be phenomenal for this ecosystem to get some more of the builders and voices involved here, and at a very high level in terms of what we're doing. So Hedera has some representation on the TSC, but they don't control it. They don't have any controlling interest on it. It's the TSC members who get to decide, what code we're going to build. The HIP process is going to move. Yeah, it has moved. Now, I mean, we haven't actually moved the repo over, but the HIP process is owned by the TSC. So if you have a new HIP, you'd come to the TSC to get it approved. The TSC will review the HIPs and vote on it. And again, there's only a handful of us from Hashgraph, a couple from LimeChain, 1 from Hedera, Lehman, and then a bunch of other people who have yet to be elected to fill those seats. So it should be very representative of the people who are actually building on Hedera or building Hedera. That'll be representing that. Now, so we have some HIP. It comes through. We all vote for it. It's great. Hedera looks at the HIP. The governing council looks at it, and they say technical committee, TechCom, as we call it specifically, looks at the HIP and says, "Oh, that's a wonderful HIP. We love it." Then they can accept the HIP. Now, on the open source side, on Hyro, if I got my Hyro on, Hyro can go implement the HIPs that were approved by the technical steering committee, whether or not Hedera approves them.
Gotcha.
But Hedera will never deploy that code to mainnet if they don't approve of it. And we, as an open source community, are interested in supporting Hedera. So, there's going to be a partnership here. We're going to be saying, okay, you guys don't like that HIP. That's very important information. What can we do to make it acceptable? But we may find that there are some HIPs that will never be acceptable to them, but are necessary in the community. I'll give you an example. If we were doing like these, somebody wanted to take the Hyro source code and they wanted to build a network and run it behind a firewall for their bank. And let's say that they wanted to have some kind of service added to it that was, proprietary for their system. And they said, hey, but we can implement this in a way that's open source, and anybody who's doing something like us could reuse this code. And Hedera says, no, we don't want that on mainnet. Not a problem. We have spent, we shipped our modularized services code in June, I think, right? So we spent a good deal of time modularizing the code base. Consequently, we can actually take the Hyro source code and make a build of it for this, theoretical private usage. And we could do a build of it for Hedera, and Hedera still gets to deploy the code that they approve of. And we have, other builds that people can use for other purposes. That's all fine. So we're going to find ways, is it possible for there to be conflict between Hyro and Hedera? Yes. Is it likely? No. In the cases where there are differences, like for example, one a voting service. Let's say that the community says, yes, we want to add a voting service to this source code base.
Yeah.
And we're like, Hedera's like, no, we don't really want to do that on mainnet. Great. We can still implement it on the open source side. And then Hedera could just say, yeah, I'm not going to take that module. And they deploy without the module.
Right.
That's fine. Those sorts of coordinations, I think, is what's going to happen. I have a really hard time seeing a future where Hyro and Hedera are truly at odds. I just don't really think that's going to happen. But any sort of misalignment of interest, we'll just work together in order to make sure that what is built and produced and deployed to mainnet is according to Hedera specifications. They control what code is deployed to mainnet. Hyro controls what code is developed, and the two of them together work together to make sure that the code that's developed can be deployed to mainnet.
Gotcha. So the hope here is kind of like for that best of both worlds scenario where, we want to be able to have these kind of unlimited possibilities for what this network can be, but still give Hedera the final decision on what makes it to mainnet. So this network can grow outside of potentially what Hedera wants it to be, and for enterprise usage or whatever it might be to deploy all these different networks. But then Hedera still has the ability to say, well, this is what we want our network. This is how we want our network to function. These are the pieces we're going to use. And there's a high likelihood you're saying that in the years to come, Hyro and then the code base that's used for the Hedera mainnet may look very different, and that's okay.
Yeah. I think it's unlikely to be very different, but It could be. And if it were, it's kind of like a Linux distribution in a way. There's a single Linux kernel. They produce a Linux kernel, but then you have all these different Linux distributions that are built off of the same kernel, right? A lot of the same open source code goes into all of them and different distributions. That's fine. I think that's good. Somebody else was asking, like, well, are we giving away the value of our HBARs or whatever? Can anybody run the network? It's like, look, a network exists because of the network effect. It's just setting up a few nodes and saying, look, I have a new network doesn't really mean a lot.
Yeah.
There's a ton of effort that goes into, as you know, right? Getting the USDC or whoever else to deploy your network.
Yeah.
All the integrations, the bridges, the saucer swap, getting a DEX on there, or the wallets. There's this huge ecosystem around it. The likelihood of somebody being able to take Hyro, which they could have done anyway. All this code was open source anyway. Every one of these blockchains is open source anyway. You can do the same thing with Ethereum. You can do the same thing with any other network. Just go take the code and set up your own network. Good luck with that. That's going to be really hard to do. So I don't think I see this as like an unqualified improvement of the situation that we're in. There's no new risks that we're taking on. There's it just makes it more inclusive, more vendor neutral for control of the source code itself.
Gotcha. Okay, so what you're saying is when people raise the question of, intellectual property and forking the network and this and that, and considerations for like potential competitors and other Hedera copies spinning up, what you're saying more so is that doesn't really have anything to do so much with having the code or being able to stand up a network. It's more to do with that network effect. Like, how do you get a governing council? How do you get a large group of validators? How do you get these DEXs? How do you get this liquidity on the network? Those are the real barriers and arguably kind of protections, competitive protections. And I think that there's another dynamic I'm kind of feeling here at play that I think is very healthy for Hedera. I think that this also places some additional very healthy pressure on Hedera to continue to kind of stay on the top of this Hyro mountain, and I think that is a very healthy thing, that it can be looked at as an incentive to say, okay, it's out here, everything's out in the open, and I think that definitely is an incentive for Hedera to really double down and deliver as a network, leveraging Hyro.
Yeah, and I think that they are very conscientious about wanting Hedera. I mean, what's interesting about our situation, right, is like when I first joined Hedera, like all the different aspects were in one house. We had the development in one place, we had the business development in one place, we had the marketing in one place, the governing
Right.
council, Manson Lehman, Mance was the CEO, and everything else, all in one place. And then as those pieces have been factored out, it requires there's like the good and the bad of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like monarchy versus democracy. You go down democracy's road, and there's a lot more coordination and competing interests and things like that you got to deal with. Monarchy is really nice and effective. You can get things done,
Sure.
but it's one of those things that's actually really frustrating to me personally. Is all the times on Twitter when people on other networks, not bad mouthing anybody, but they badmouth us by saying that, oh, we're not a decentralized. And I can tell you that decentralization is a very serious thing for everybody at Hedera, at Hashgraph. These moves that we make, you can see that we're putting our control where our mouth is.
Right.
And Hedera did that as well. The governing council is responsible for governing the operation of the public network.
Right.
But the code was broken out, and officially with Hyro broken out into the Linux Foundation for control. And business development was broken out. HBAR Foundation, Hashgraph Association, so it's like, yeah, there's a whole group of people, and it is a democracy. It really is. There's a lot of everybody's making their independent decisions to try to make this successful, and the governing council is very, very much interested in the success of the network. And I think that they demonstrated their willingness to put their control where their mouth is. It's like, not only are we interested in decentralization, but we're going to move the code to this independent organization as well. And I think they should be
Gotcha.
commended for that.
Yeah, 100%. Like it's definitely, from, as you've said, maybe from a purely business standpoint, this isn't something that necessarily benefits Hedera, but from a network standpoint, from a community standpoint, from a future standpoint, this is really the definition of like making those short-term sacrifices for long-term sustainability. So yeah, and that's why I kind of was telling people before you jumped on is like, I do feel this is really going to be, when we look back, this is going to be one of those turning points that is a component of this Hedera 2.0 that Mant and others are kind of speaking to. The further decentralization of this, and not only just expanding Hedera, the tentacles of Hedera's ecosystem, but going into these other ecosystems, creating this kind of graph, this fabric between everything that just, as you were saying, allows things to move more freely and remove some of those barriers. Now, one thing you touched on that was really interesting to me, and maybe something that might be helpful for some people, is looking back a little bit in the journey getting to Hyro. You mentioned the modularization of the code base, which I imagine was like a massive effort.
It was massive.
Yeah, it was massive. And so I just wanted to kind of touch on that. Like, can you take us a little bit through that journey of getting to Hyro? What were some of the like challenges, any kind of big moments in the kind of journey to Hyro?
Yeah, I think there were a few big ones, and it has been a journey. It's been many years in the making, with intentional decisions that were made along the way. The first one was, you may remember, at the time of open access and for the first year or two after that, the sum of the source code of the consensus node was what was known as, what did we call it? Open access.
It was open
review.
Open review. That's right.
Review.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you could see the code, but it was, it was like a month delayed from what was actually being built and all that kind of stuff. So I think the first big momentous thing that Hedera did was to purchase that code from Swirlds and open source it all. That was a big deal. So once all that, because it used to be like if you unwound this thing all the way, at one point, Lehman invents the Hashgraph. He and Mance are like, we should build a business around this. And they had several different business ideas that they were pursuing. And Hedera was like one of them, but not the only one, right? They had other ones. And so the platform code, as we call it, was sort of owned by Swirlds. And then Hedera used it under license and built on top of it, is the way that it was. And so the decision by the governing council to actually purchase it from Swirlds and open source it was a really big deal, because now we had a complete source code was open source, and it was all under the Apache 2 license. They didn't do anything funny with some kind of tricky license. You know, It was just straightforward Apache 2. That was a really big deal. Then there has been sort of like a continual journey to try to clean up the source code, if you will. I mean, one of the challenges you have is you have an open source code. How do you get people to contribute to that code base? Because if you just open source it, but you don't get any contribution, then, okay, people can see your source code, but you don't really have an ecosystem built around it. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So getting those contributions is an essential part of what you're trying to accomplish, but it's very difficult to get to. You need to have documentation. You need to have, development processes. Like in a normal development team, let's say a non-open source normal development team in the world, you've got Slack or email or whatever you're using for communication. You have a whole bunch of channels on there where all the developers are working on. A new person gets hired into the company. They immediately get rights onto the source code. They can create branches. They can merge. They can do code reviews, all that kind of stuff. If you have a problem, you call up 3 of your buddies and you work it out, or you go to a whiteboard and you sketch it out. None of that stuff works in an open source context.
Right.
If I'm an external developer and all the decisions are happening on a whiteboard somewhere that I don't have any access to, or in a Zoom call that I don't have access to, or to a Slack channel I don't have access to, how can I participate? And if I can't participate, I might spend time working on some code that then everybody else just dumps on or throws away or says it won't work, and I have no idea why, right? So part of this journey, which we haven't finished this journey, we're still on it, right? Mm-hmm. Getting the source code open source is part of it. Or not open source, but added as well. Getting it open source, yes. Getting it added to a foundation with governance, yes. But now there's another step that we're still working on, which is open development model. How do you do development in an open way? Right. And there's some tricky things there that we have to work through. Like, for example, what's the release process? How do we go through releases? How do we decide what goes into a release and what doesn't go into a release? All that stuff has to be opened up as well, in some way, shape, or form. There's got to be more visibility into what we're doing. We need to have better documentation so that people know what's going on and can actually learn it. Like, how do they learn the internals? As a I don't know what's the right way to say it. As a person who's always at the very deep end of all these technical details, I know how hard and what the delta is between somebody who's like casually interested and then wants to know the nitty-gritty details. There's a huge chasm there. Mm-hmm. And if we don't start supplying a path for that, getting contributors would be very difficult. The other thing is just like, as of now, if you were to join Hashgraph, you don't immediately become a committer on the project. Sorry, It doesn't happen anymore. You have to earn your place just like everybody else does.
Okay.
So yeah, you want to be a committer, that's awesome. Start contributing. Give us a whole bunch of contributions, and then the maintainers will vote as to whether you get to be a committer or not. And if you want to be a maintainer, guess what? That doesn't happen just because you got a promotion at Hashgraph. Sorry, it doesn't work that way anymore. You want to be a maintainer, a whole bunch of good contributions, and the maintainers have to vote you in as a maintainer. And if you left Hashgraph, if you earned your way up, let's say that you were at Hashgraph and you earned your way up to be a maintainer and then you leave, guess what? You don't lose your maintainership. You're still a maintainer. You earned it. It's part of who you are, right? So those sorts of organizational changes some of those things are immediate as of now, and some of those things we're still working on. Like, how do we do our communication? LFDT set up some Discord channels for us in the LFDT Discord space. I haven't even logged into it yet. I'm not sure how we're going to do that communication, right? Do we just use the discussion boards on GitHub? Do we use Discord? Do we create a public Slack that people can join? Like, what do we do? I don't know. We're still trying to figure out some of those details. So it's a journey that we're still on. We're sort of like at the mountaintop and we can see the valley, but we're not there yet.
I think also too, kind of coming back to the beginning of our discussion, and I think that you know, these have really been some key criticisms of Hedera and developing in the space of, as you described, you know, the roles and capabilities of affecting the network are or have been tied to your organization, which is, I think, the source of a lot of these kind of symptoms of frustration we see in the community.
Absolutely.
And what you're really getting at is this actually is a process of decoupling control over how you can affect the network from where you work, essentially.
Absolutely. Yes. And that's one of the things that I'm very excited about is, you know, because we would feel it, right? There was, the frustration was very real on Discord. There were some very, you know, hurtful things said at times.
Yeah.
And we would just be like, the fundamental root cause of the problem here is that people don't feel like they have any other way to
Right.
affect the outcome.
Right. Other than
And
getting angry and expressing frustration through force. That's the only mechanism they've had, right?
all they have is totally understandable. 100%. I get it. Right. And if they didn't, nothing, they would never be heard. Right. It was like the only thing they could do.
Yeah.
So it was like the system was set up to produce that sort of discontent, which is not good.
Yes.
The nice thing about having proper governance is that anybody can earn a spot. And now, you know, anybody can earn a spot. And so do it. Go for it. And the consequence of that should be a much more together sort of approach.
Yeah. I like that. And one thing I want to touch on too, you mentioned you're still on this journey, and the next challenge is, how do we stand up these pillars for communication, for collaboration? I mean, open source software development has changed so much over the past 10, 20 years. And a lot of people do view open software or open source development much like they see like content creators and stuff, where nowadays a lot of folks might not be familiar, but like some of the web applications you use or critical infrastructure, like, are dependent on like 2-3 people, you know? And so there are these loud personalities. There are these big things. So when you have a product that, you know, has, you know, I imagine like dozens of repositories, and you have this big Hyro ecosystem, right? You really start to think about all those different personalities attaching to different parts of it, leading different parts of it. Like, what are you interested in diving in? And then the complexities of conversations. And what I would say, as maybe a piece of feedback for you guys on this next step of the journey is, I think when we look at how do we communicate and how do we build up those pillars, I think that the ecosystem already, and many of these folks in the ecosystem may already have those answers, or have maybe already developed some of those channels. There might already be some of these nooks and crannies in this ecosystem where these people are already kind of working on stuff. So I think that definitely it might be an opportunity for you guys to take a pit stop and kind of go, hey, is this kind of communication and collaboration potentially already happening? Can we step into that? Similar to what you guys have done at a broader scale at the Linux Foundation, of going, well, there's this thing already here. Maybe instead of reinventing the wheel, we step into it, you know?
Yeah. And I think it's you know, on the day-to-day work that engineers have, one of the challenges that we'll be faced on this whole communication side is the effort that it takes to communicate broadly versus one-on-one. So in the, like, for example, before your call, this call, I was on another call, and we were discussing the, you know, details around how we dynamically change the address book that's used by consensus nodes. If you were to look at community nodes and anonymous nodes, in order to get there, we need to wait for somebody to be able to add a node to the network or remove a node from the network dynamically. Whereas today we can only do it at upgrade boundaries, you know, each month. It'd be nice if I had a new node and I showed up and I said, here's my new node, and look, people have stakes to it. Will you please, you know, plug it in and it starts working? That'd be nice. For that, we need what we call a dynamic address book. So we're talking about the details of that. Now, I had written all this stuff down. We had this big document. It's actually on GitHub. You could go look at it. It has all the details on the architecture and design of the consensus system, and you know, how dynamic address books fit into it and all that kind of stuff. And with the other experts on the team, there was a misunderstanding. We didn't understand each other. And so we got onto a call, after a couple of weeks of back and forth online. It's like, okay, let's just get a call and
Yeah.
work this out. That'll be one of those things that we just have to figure out, how do we do this effectively in open source sense?
Right.
If we do everything through, typing, then it's going to take longer to get understanding and get things done. Because I'm sure that the people who are listening, they're not just like, yeah, that's great, you guys are building great software. What does it mean to me? Like, how do I get my HIP implemented? If I were to say, oh yeah, HIPs are going to take 10 times longer to get done, you'd be like, no, that's not acceptable. It shouldn't get worse. So I think part of the challenge that we have on the communication side is to figure out, how do we do it in such a way that we don't lose any of the effectiveness at actually getting things implemented.
Right.
Long term, it always works better for you, because those communications required you to write things down, to create diagrams, to publish documentation, and all those things are good for the next person who comes in to learn the system. But like in the moment, it can be really frustrating, because you're like, this should have been like a 3-hour thing, and now it's a 3-week thing. What's going on here? And so those are just the sort of challenges that we have to work out. But
I think the other thing that you hit on too that was very interesting is you're talking about this chasm between someone just piquing their interest into things and then diving in really hardcore into Hyro. And I think something that should be continued is, I do think that a lot of soon-to-be developers catch the bug on social media platforms, most prominently X. And I think that those forms of communication are so important, because everybody gets to be a fly on the wall. And seeing what you've been doing was like super refreshing, where I was like, not only are people getting the information they need, but I'm actually watching Richard kind of learn in real time, like, oh yeah, that's how to explain this, or okay, that's how this is kind of connected. And it's this really fast feedback loop. So there might also be something to be said about like working backwards a bit and going, sure, we're on this other side of the chasm, we're going to have to come up with all sorts of various robust, workflows and stuff. But on this side of the chasm, what if we just tweet more, and so I think that that's something cool, where in that particular situation you described, it might be so valuable in so many different ways for you to just maybe after the show or something, just post one of those tweets and be like, we're trying to work on this address book thing. And like, this is kind of what happened. This is what kind of we're thinking of. And as you see, all of a sudden people start piling in. And I feel like a lot of those people are soon to be developers, maintainers, board members of this thing. And if they don't get that chance on kind of that far side of the chasm, I think that's really where the magic's going to happen as well. So it's so funny in this industry, and I think in the open source development industry more broadly, it's like sometimes it just comes down to posting a tweet. It's so stupid, but it's so true.
Even with like out proper context, or sometimes I worry like, it's like, I could put this tweet out and nobody will understand anything that it means. And, I should do another thing. And then I should write some more context. And then I should, next thing you know, it's turned into this massive thing. And I'm like, I can't do that. And I think I just need to, I think you're right. Like building the bridge from both sides is what we need to do in order to make it work.
And the really cool part as well is it's not like the Hashgraph where you have to carry over the state with every message. Like I fall into that trap sometimes, right? I fall into that trap sometimes where it's like, I wanted to say like, oh, this thing's happening now, but I'm like, but are they going to know what I mean by that? And I got to do this thing. And what I've learned is that's kind of what when you have these followers, that's kind of what it's all about, is when they read the next one, they're still holding the state of all the different things you've said previously, and they're adding it to their like little internal hash graph kind of thing. And so I think I would definitely encourage, other folks in their bio where I'm not comfortable on social media, similar to yourself. That's really the beauty of it, is you can look at X as like just a big group conversation. And I think you can trust that most of the people that are following you and participating in those discussions are right along there with you. And I think it's totally fine to not worry so much about context and just kind of send the next message, send the next thought. I think, my best tweets are the ones that I put the least thought into, to be honest, the ones that resonate with people the most. So I definitely encourage that 100%. Everybody on the team,
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm definitely not the only one who's uncomfortable with tweeting. But I think that it is important. I mean, I follow people too who I'm like actually really impressed with what they did. In terms of how they tweet. I'm definitely not an engagement farmer, that's for sure. I'm just gonna,
not a reply guy.
No, I'm just throwing out whatever whatever I've got. But yeah, no, I think that's really good insight, and it is something that I need to do, and I've kind of felt that way actually for a few years.
Yeah.
I have to say though that the work, one of the things that I love about working on Hedera's code is, as an engineer, it's like the trifecta of all the hardest things that you have to try to do. So your number one, all the code is open source. So, as an engineer, you always want your code to be good.
Yeah.
You really want it to be good if everybody else can look at it. So, there's some incentive there. Number two, it's got to be absolutely secure. Billions of dollars are riding on this thing.
Right. Yeah.
You cannot screw this up.
Yeah.
Number three, it's executing on the public internet in the most hostile environment possible. So you have to be very careful about what you build, because it's not like if I was writing bank software. Bank software has trillions of dollars running on it too. Yes, but I don't have to worry about internal, the internal systems being, attacking each other. Whereas on a public internet, you have to worry about these sorts of things. It has to be incredibly high performance. It has to, let's see, we got the performance, we got the security, we got the fact that it's open source. Oh yeah, and the other one, you have to deliver features quickly, because you don't want to miss the NFT thing. You don't want to miss whatever the next big thing is. You have to be able to deliver quickly. Those are really hard things to do. It is very hard. In fact, in the software engineering industry, it's generally, the three sides of the triangle. It's impossible. You pick two, you can't pick all three. You want security, you want fast development and performance. Like, pick two, you don't get to pick three. Here we pick all three. So it's an incredibly difficult task. And if you look at Ethereum, they actually don't do the speed of change thing. They picked two, which was they wanted to have stability, and well, they didn't even get performance out of it. They just picked one, like stability. Again, not saying anything bad about those guys. Super impressed with a lot of things that they do.
We love you, Ethereum. We love you.
Yeah, that's right. No, I'm like super impressed. A lot of things they do, I look at and say, yep, that's very good. We should do more like that. But in this case, at Hedera, it's like we've got all three of the hard problems, and we're doing them all simultaneously all the time, which is, so for anybody who's thinking about, what good open source project you want to contribute to, if you're looking for the most hardcore, it's right here. It doesn't get any more hardcore than this. So there's lots of really good problems to solve.
Yeah, 100%. And yeah, before I move on to my last couple questions here is, I think I see that as definitely one of the best first steps you guys can take in this on the other side of this is, now that the mechanism of resistance has been removed. It's like we've talked about the separation of these roles to where you work. I think that it's a much better opportunity for you guys to come out front on social media. And when you hit these walls where you're like, what do we kind of do? Like really lean on this community, and even the non-developers in this community that are users of the product that can provide that product feedback in a really direct way. I think that really the winning open source projects out there are the ones that have, the engineers out front communicating with the users and in a public forum. Because at that point you're killing three birds with one stone. It's like everyone can see what's going on. Not a lot of folks are in GitHub, and it's motivating. Like probably getting those messages and having those conversations and stuff is like very motivating to kind of be like, wow, okay, the feedback loop is tight on this, And
I think it's great for the community too. Like they need to know that there's a lot of engineering work that's going on. And you don't have that visibility. You go, what's going on? What's being developed? I didn't see a new feature. What's happening? There's a lot of work going on. And I know like community nodes is one of those things, right? It's like, community nodes is removed from the roadmap. Everybody gets upset. Well, it was just in the next 3 months. It's not in the next 3 months. there's a lot of work that needs to be done in order to get there. Real technical work that has to be done in order to get there, and we're working on it heavily. But it's not like So I think having more of that open communication helps solve those problems. It's kind of like with the other one, right? Why are people angry? Because they cannot participate. They have no way of being able to participate. Why are people discouraged about the roadmap? Because they don't see everything that's going on into the roadmap. If they had more visibility into what was going on, like when Vitalik gets up and says, we got the merge and the splurge and the purge and the whatever urges, all of his urges, it's actually really helpful, right? Everybody can look at it and they can go, oh yeah, okay, I can see where we are on this journey. None of those things are telling me that it's going to be the next 3 months or 6 months or whatever. But all of those things are telling me where our journey is and what it is that we're trying to accomplish. I think that kind of communication is really important. And those are the sorts of things that Hyro will be publishing is, here are all the projects that we're working on. And this is why we're working on them. And this is where community nodes is in that list and why we have to do these other ones before we can get there.
Gotcha.
They have to be built on top of it.
I think that's a key thing you hit on is it's not just where is it in the roadmap and what is in the roadmap, but what's the thought process behind it? What's the reasoning for it? What's the context for it? I think that's been the missing piece for so many people of like, okay, we got the stuff in the roadmap, but why this and not that? Why this ahead of the other thing? And it's felt like if Hedera would just kind of provide that insight, it's like, I'm pretty sure most people would be like, oh, I get it. That makes sense. Or I don't understand this stuff, but it's great that, there's someone that does, so I think that is going to be hugely valuable for the whole ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely. And Hyro will be the home for these things. Hyro's doing the roadmaps, the hips and all that kind of stuff will be coming out of the TSC.
I love that. I wanted to just kind of maybe now just drill down on a couple of things because this kind of touches on a few different questions that I've seen floating around in the ecosystem. And obviously folks, especially that maybe like aren't developers or are just kind of HBAR investors or whatever it is, they're kind of like, how does this trickle down to somebody who maybe isn't even talking about code and just like using the ecosystem and using the products in the ecosystem and maybe just holding HBAR or something. And just to kind of kick off on this, it's like, can we talk about what meaningful impacts will this have on like the Hedera ecosystem? Not just for developers, but kind of a little more broadly, like for like these investors and enthusiasts, like can we extrapolate on that a little bit and kind of talk about what kinds of impacts could this have for folks outside of that developer circle?
Yeah. So when I look at what leads to success, what are the essential success criteria that you need for broad adoption of your network, right? There's some basic table stakes, code has to be available, things like that, sure. But then there's kind of two big things. One of them in our case, in the sort of business that we're in, liquidity is a big part of it. Like there's got to be users, there's got to be money. That's important. Neither one of those. The user aspect is something I can have an impact on. The money part, that's somebody else's problem. I can't deal with that. But then there's another aspect of it, which is like the developers. Where are the developers who are building of this stuff? Like where does that all come from? You look at, I don't know, like a PayPal or Starbucks or whoever. A lot of these guys are deploying to some L2 that's over on Ethereum and whatnot, because it's sort of, it's sort of just where people are at. So you've got to be able to bring in all these sorts of people to your network in order to be really successful. And I think that having those public roadmaps, those things that we were just talking about, is actually an essential part of that too. If I'm an enterprise developer, I'm an enterprise architect, I'm sitting, behind over there at Oracle, how do I even know that there's such a thing as Hedera? And when I am evaluating technology, one of the things that I'm going to use to evaluate technology is how many other people are using this thing. There's a very strong herd mentality in engineering, and it's not for no reason. It's because you are about to commit, millions of dollars of R&D to build a solution on top of some library or service. You want to know that thing's still going to be there 5 years from now. And one of the ways that you de-risk that is by doing the same thing everybody else is doing. Like, if everybody else is on this, then at least if I got it wrong, I'm just as wrong as all my competitors, so we're all good.
Right. Okay.
So I think that, being part of the Linux Foundation, having access to all of these enterprises and all of the developers that are part of that, individual developers, enterprise developers, everybody, being part of that ecosystem, getting more recognition and notice from them, being able to say, we are part of the Linux Foundation. You can trust that this project will be here 5 years from now because we're part of this larger system. In addition to all of the, I tell you, the Linux Foundation was very happy with like all of our council members as well, because they could say, wow, that's a lot of companies that are supporting your open source project.
Right.
Like
Okay.
that's very true. So we're sort of like building that. So I think, yeah, the liquidity part aside, because I don't really have much control over that. But on the, LFDT won't have any impact on liquidity, right? That's something else. But as far as like engagement from people who are looking to try some piece of software, we do have a real opportunity to make a difference there. And I think those are the two things that matter. Again, it's like Facebook is not successful because of Facebook's user interface, right? It was successful because it created a network effect. Yes. And in order to create that network effect for Hedera, we need to get, it's a network effect of developers and it's a network effect of finance and users. Those are kind of the network effects that you're trying to look for. So I think for the normal investor, when they look at this, what should they think? They should judge us by how well we bring on more people to help build this thing and direct this thing. If they see that happening, then they would say, you'd be able to see tangible progress. If at the end of the day we don't end up getting any more participation or collaboration, then we haven't really achieved the goal.
Gotcha. Okay, so basically, to kind of just to tackle what you're saying is if you're an HBAR investor, obviously HBAR people are like, I want my HBAR to go up and this and that. It's like, we talk about enterprise use cases. We talk about the pipeline. We talk about these things that Hedera wants to help bring to market on this network to drive up TPS and usage and revenue and these different types of things. And what you're saying is this cuts down a little deeper on that and removes barriers for enterprise developers to start building on Hedera. And it starts to create that network effect flywheel of, the reality is, guys, people are going to use what other people are using. And we can talk about the chicken and the egg and the cart and the horse all day, but at some point you just have to make a move and you just have to dive in. And kind of to what Lehman said in his presentation, Hedera is betting everything on this. This is their dive in moment. And this is kind of what you're speaking to, is like, if we really want to do something that addresses the majority of the problems we see in this ecosystem, this multi-year initiative that's ongoing, this is really the one that's at the lowest level, the one that's at the deepest level.
Yeah, it's the one that at least I can affect. I can participate in.
Yeah, exactly.
I let the other guys have to deal with the other part of it because we can't do it all. Yeah,
we can't do it all. I was going to say too, like, I mean, I'm pretty sure I know the answer to this question, but just to kind of, because I know this is something that people keep bringing up, and maybe just to put it to bed, it's like, does the utility of HBAR or its role in the ecosystem change in any way with this new initiative? Yeah.
No.
It's the same old HBAR we know and love. And we talked about the HIP process. The other thing too is, with this and with the developer angle and stuff, we've been talking a lot, almost exclusively about like enterprise. But when we look at now flipping to the Web3 native world, right? Like we look at the Uniswaps of the world, the Saucer swaps of the world, the hash packs, and potentially other Web3 products on other networks wanting maybe to move to Hedera or integrate Hedera. Does this Hyro stuff affect that as well outside of the enterprise stuff?
So some of these projects that you mentioned, I would just say are enterprises in trajectory. In that,
right. Okay.
Like Uniswap is a pretty big deal.
Yeah. I'm talking more like projects or companies or whatever. Yeah. That don't touch the Web 2 world really.
Yeah. Like the native Web 3.
Yeah.
I mean, I would hope so. I would think that, again, like as in Hyro, the prior, the technical steering committee is going to be reviewing all the HIPs, which gives what changes are going to be made on the network. Like let's say the metadata NFT HIP, right?
Right.
So metadata NFTs, that's great. We can, or there's that one we've already done and implemented, but there's a batch transaction HIP right now that I think we started that one like maybe 2 years ago. If you were a builder, like a Web3 builder, and this was important to you, then this is the place to come. Before it was a little bit tricky. It was like, well, who do I talk to? I could go. I don't have any way to get invited to the Hedera technical committee meetings, so I don't have any way to pitch myself to them directly, and I don't have. It wasn't so direct. Now it's direct. It's like we have a technical steering committees. Those meetings are all public. Everything's public. You're interested, then you can get on the agenda and you can come and you can say, this is important for my business and this is why. We could have that sort of thing very direct. So I think for builders in the Web3 space, having a direct way to impact and get involved in the HIT process is huge. And on the code side, as we were talking about before, right? If you have some HIP and it's super important to you, in the classic open source sense, you put your money where your mouth is. You say, this is important to me and I will contribute. Sometimes people will say things like, you guys are just trying to get free work from other people. It's like, no, you could look at it that way, but that's not the right way to look at it. The right way to look at it is, in the open source, if you have something you want, you can get it, but you have to participate. There's no freeloaders. Right? Everybody has to participate. If you just want to sit back and let us do the work, then it'll get done when it gets done. If it's important to you, you participate. So I think having that governance, having that HIP process, having the opportunity for anybody to become a committer means that you have control of your destiny. If you are a saucer swap and there's some particular feature that you need in the smart contract system, there's a path. There's a path to participation and to being able to affect that change and have that control or destiny over your own future.
I remember, and maybe it's still up there, but I remember on the Hedera.com website, there was that picture of Lehman with his arm out, and there was that quote, carve out your own piece of cyberspace. And I think what you're touching on here is like that being brought to life now, whereas before you'd see that quote and it was like, it doesn't quite feel that way, but I'm starting to feel that now. And like you said, these kind of things take time. But it feels like we're getting closer to that vision that Lehman kind of laid out of anybody being able to reach in and affect this to grab their piece of it. So I think that's amazing. And on that, I want to kind of start wrapping this up, but I wanted just to ask one or two more questions, then just look at some stuff that people have been asking in the chat. But this I think would be really helpful as an exercise to help people, both developers and non-developers, kind of understand what the goal of this initiative is. And I think that the exercise is, can we flip forward, a few years in the future and envision like what that Hedera and Hyro ecosystem looks like? Obviously a few years in the future, Hedera is no longer on that the governing board. There's new members that have been flipped over. Both from like a technical standpoint, an ecosystem standpoint, is there a picture in your mind of what this looks like in the, if we flip forward 3, 4, 5 years?
Yeah. If we're successful, right, 3, 4, 5 years from now, I would hope that the number of, if you were to look at the committers and the maintainers on these projects, that it would be much more diverse than it is today. I don't know what the numbers would be, but if half of them were from third parties, that would be tremendous, right? It'd be tremendous.
Yeah.
If the velocity at which we are working is double or triple what it is today, because we have 5, 6 times as many people participating, that would be tremendous. If the community who is contributing feels like they are part of the core development team, we have succeeded. We have done what we set out to do. If the governing the technical steering committee, the TSC. Well, by rule, it's going to be diverse anyway, so we're in pretty good shape here. In a few months, we should have it. But if people are engaged in the election process, so that the members of the technical steering committee actually represent the voters, and there's a diverse set of voters, then we will be successful. We should have it should be a feeling that it is widely participatory, that everybody has a voice. Doesn't mean things are going to go the way that you like. It doesn't mean that you're going to get what you want.
Right.
But it means that you can participate on equal footing with everybody else. And 3 to 5 years from now, there should be a lot of other, everybody else's. There should be a lot of projects. It should not be that all the projects are, Hashgraph people or anybody who's paid directly or indirectly from Hedera. It should be just a bunch of people. I would love to see, enterprises that are part of Linux Foundation, actually have, people with their email addresses actually submitting code to our projects.
Yeah.
That's the future I see.
I love that. That's great. I mean, what we've been talking about and kind of this thing that you illustrate is, in a weird way, I think when people really start to understand this, especially the non-developer crowd, kind of how my brain works as well, as I go, oh, this is what we've been talking about this whole time, but we haven't had the inside look. We haven't had that peek behind the curtain to see what was going on. And as it turns out, what's going on is a process of removing the curtain, right? What we're trying to hope to, what we've been hoping for. So that's really how I summarize it is it might not look like how I pictured, but we are on that journey, in a very powerful way to kind of, I think, where we've wanted to go since 2018, 2019, since this public network. Yeah. So I think that's really the best way I can frame it is if people say like, what's the impact of this? What's the impact on HBAR? What does this mean? I think that really what this is what we've been hoping for in a lot of ways, from both a technical standpoint, an ecosystem standpoint, a business standpoint. That's kind of how I see it a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Love it. So really quick, there was some questions some folks asked. Jim from Acor, he said, great talk. I think people have really been enjoying this conversation, but he says there are close to 100 repos for Hyro. Do you have any tips for new developers to get a better understanding of the code base or specific needs that the higher functional technical priorities for the team?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are a whole pile of repos, and each one of them is fairly deep. So one of the things that we're doing, actually, we had, there was a website that we set up on Hedera.com. I think it's under Hedera.com/developers, maybe.
I think I recall that. Yeah.
It started to break this down, but one of the things that we're doing is we're working on the Hyro pages to put some sort of a taxonomy of the different projects. Like which projects are kind of like the core ones, and then
very cool.
Almost like rings of on the outer layers. And also, each one of the projects is going through and creating a bunch of good first issues. So we're participating in the Hacktoberfest. GitHub has in October they do a Hacktoberfest.
Okay.
And so we're participating in that. We're producing a bunch of good first issues so that people could come and just pick something up easy to get started with.
Okay.
A lot of those will probably be things like, oh, your getting started documentation is junk. Here's a PR to improve it.
Great.
Like, fantastic. Let's do that. That's a great PR.
Yeah.
Don't come expecting everything to be all beautiful, but I guess that's part of it, right? You just do your work. So, so we're participating in Hacktoberfest. We have good first issues. We're working on adding some pages to the Hyro website that sort of breaks down what these different projects are, how they're related to each other. One thing that I've wanted to do for a long time, and probably it's a really bad idea to say this publicly because then people are going to be asking me, when it's going to get finished. But we need to have a proper, video that we can post on YouTube or something that describes the architecture and how all the pieces fit together.
Right.
Because even things like, what exactly is the relationship between a consensus node and a mirror node? Or
Right.
even questions like, what kind of queries can I do on a consensus node versus a mirror node? Why are we trying to deprecate some of the queries on consensus nodes and move them to mirror nodes? Why? Well, there's very good reasons for that. One of them is you should never ever query a single consensus node because it could lie to you. You should query at least a third. Well, why is it a third? Well, because consensus requires a little bit more than 2/3. So if you query a third, then anyway, there's like all these sorts of things, right? We need to have some videos like this that describe the overall architecture, and then you can map that onto the repos. You would know exactly which repo you were looking for. Otherwise, you just see a big wodge of repos, and you're like, "What are these things?"
Yeah.
And it's pretty intimidating.
That stuff's going to be so important. That kind of content. Another question. I think this is this was on my mind. Coinman the HBAR Barbarian asks, "Will Hyro have an X account?"
Good question. I never even thought about it. I don't know. I guess probably. I mean, I'm just thinking. We don't have any staff. Hyro doesn't have any staff. There's a technical steering committee, and that's it. So if we were going to have a Twitter account or X account for Hyro, who would run that account? Like, is it a member of the TSC or? I don't know. That's a good question.
That'd be really interesting. Yeah, I think that like this is the other thing that's interesting about open source software development is we're learning more and more with open source software development is code and different things like that is a component of it. But as you're touching on, a huge part of open source software development has nothing to do with GitHub or code. It has everything to do with communications and messaging. And so I totally see the opportunity for a non-developer person that isn't involved in the code base, but is a part of those committees that is focused on communications, right? And like, we've got folks like Grelf's like, I'll run it.
Yeah, I know.
Imagine if we got
Grelf. I can imagine.
Yeah. So I think that's something to really think about is, these different roles that aren't necessarily related to the code base itself, but maybe could perform some of those functions and make those same contributions, but instead of those contributions being pushed into a repo, they're pushed out to social media. That's very interesting to think about.
We definitely need something because, it would be really handy if we were going to review HIP whatever, that we could put out some message that said, "Hey, we're reviewing HIP whatever. Here's the meeting if you would like to join it."
Yeah.
It's like, well, yeah, I'll yes. You're right, Grelf. Never thought about it. Come on, sir. Yeah. Well, I probably should have.
That's the beauty of this, though. I think that you talk about velocity. I think that's what we're feeling here is like when we really start to open this stuff out and pull back the curtain, it's like a lot of great ideas come to the surface and immediately it's like, oh, I didn't think of this. I didn't think of that. And let's make it happen, So I think that this energy is something that, I think is going to be great for this ecosystem. I love that.
Yeah.
So to wrap up on this has been Richard. I really appreciate your time. We've been going for we'll have been going for over an hour here. So I really, really appreciate it. I think this was something that so many people were curious about, and I think that this conversation we've had is really a great introduction or explainer to like what's going on with Hedera and Hyro right now. But just to wrap it up, let's just kind of zoom back in and look one step ahead. Right now, because as we know, a lot of what we've been talking about is kind of down the road or in motion, but who should be paying attention to Hyro right now? And what is the call to action? Who should be getting involved and how should they do it?
So I think one of the very next thing that we're working on is a TSC. So there's a lot of, processes and procedures and things like that. But the most important thing is establishing the voting methodology so that we can fill out the rest of the TSC. And I am hoping that we get some of the prominent technical voices in our community to either be nominated or to nominate themselves where appropriate for those positions. I think that filling out the TSC is the number one most critical thing that we need to work on in the next month. I'm hoping that anybody from like the wallets or the dexes or any of these other you know karate combat or whoever, any
Yeah.
of these people are eligible to sit on the TSC. So I'm trying to establish the voting procedure so that we can do that. Like, how do you do a nomination?
Right.
We have to define that. Get those nominations, and then get people to participate in that voting and fill out that TSC. I think that's really critical, and it will also give the best um, what's the word, vision into what we're really trying to do. If
Right.
we are able to get good people on that TSC, it'll really show that we're serious about having that sort of decentralization, getting other voices
Right.
involved. The other thing I would say is that if you have an open source project, or you have any open source project that is in the Hedera space, we should talk about you joining this thing. This is not a Hashgraph organization. This is a Linux Foundation organization. So if you've got some open source component to your thing, in fact, right in the charter for this thing, we talk about wallets and exchanges and bridges and dexes and so forth. If you have any open source components of those things and it would make sense for it to be part of the Linux Foundation, then we should talk about bringing that stuff over.
Love it. That's awesome. That makes me really excited. Right away, some people come to mind, and even at Hgraph, I work at Hgraph with Tyler McDonald. We're a mirror node provider, and right away I kind of go, oh my, and I'm seeing folks in the comments like May from Hashpack and Grelf and like some of these other people. Like I look just through the chat of this stream and I go, man, they're like, everybody's kind of right here and waiting. And so it's so exciting to hear this. So yeah, I definitely echo what you're saying is like, if there was ever a time to really take the deep dive on this ecosystem, now's the time. And we kind of know where that deep dive needs to happen. So that's awesome. Well, again, Richard, I really appreciate it. Was there anything else that you wanted that we didn't get a chance to touch on, or any other messages you wanted to give to the ecosystem?
Well, I just hope I didn't bore anybody today. I know.
Not at all. Not at all.
I think that I don't know if I have a closing statement. My closing statement would be, okay, well, I hadn't thought about it. It's not polished, so you guys are just going to get like my honest take on it, right?
Yeah.
We're not always going to agree with each other. That's just normal, and that's okay. And but we all have the same goal in mind. A lot of us are very much, invested in the success of Hedera. We want this to be successful. A lot of us came from good, stable places, and we're in this project because we love working with the people that we're working with, and we love the technology, and we want it to be successful. This is a big opportunity for a lot of us. I think generally this is true for everybody who's in the ecosystem. We all want to be successful. We're only going to be successful if we can do this together. And but we're not always going to agree on what the best way forward is. We're not always going to agree on the details, and that's why we have organizations like Hyro, where it can be open discussion and democratic, and we can have those discussions. And I think that yes, there's been a lot of I may not tweet very often, but I'm on Twitter a lot. I see what's going on. I understand. Same on Discord.
Yeah.
I get it, and I think that we're all on the same team. We're all same team, and we're going to try to make this thing as successful as we possibly can. So, call to action, the more participation that we can actually get at the code level, the better. We're not perfect. We're learning as we go. We're fixing things as we go, but, definitely we are completely aligned with the mission. The mission is to have an open, decentralized network, public, open, decentralized network. And we are going to make sure, to the best of our ability, that we're successful at that. And it takes a whole bunch of people to come together to make that happen. It's nothing that I can do. It's nothing you can do. It's only things that we can do. And so that's important. So
I love that. That's a great message. No, that's a great message. What you're saying is kind of something I talk about on the show a lot is whatever disagreements projects might have, or disagreements that, I'll share on the show that I have with, Hashgraph or whoever it is. It's at the end of the day, we've got more in common than not. We all want to see the success of this network. And so I think that, again, by creating this new foundation for conversation, I think it's just going to move things through a lot easier. And as well, like just, for folks that don't know how the show works, like, this is just a conversation. There was no kind of like questions provided to Richard ahead of time. Like, he's just showing up. He's probably like, I don't know what's going to happen. So this guy yells about stuff a lot, but that's how the show is. And so big kudos to you, Richard, as a vice president of software engineering at this organization, to just come on this community show, just have an open conversation. No heads up on anything. It really speaks to kind of this new direction, this new energy from the top down. At Hashgraph and Swirled and Hedera and all that kind of stuff. So really greatly appreciate you making the time and coming by, and hoping for more of this from you. I think that there's a little bit of a marketer in you. You speak very well about this stuff. Really, you do. Yeah.
Well, I think the whole secret is just to tell the truth. That's what I'm trying, but I don't know.
Love it. No, I love it. That is very true. Well, Richard, really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
All right. I appreciate it. Thanks for letting me on, Brandon.
Absolutely. Anytime. Good stuff. Well, that always gets me bullish, is when we've got these leaders at the very top of this network that are making time to come by. A show like this, like I got my dog here. It's like this isn't some kind of crazy production. So I think that's what really excites me the most about what's happening with this ecosystem. And like Richard said, I've shared my criticisms about stuff in the ecosystem, but when you really break down those barriers and have these conversations, you really learn how much you have in common and how aligned things are. And it's good to see that these problems are seen, these problems are being addressed, both in a, business way, but also kind of the world that Richard's come from, which is engineering, software, those different types of things. So I think that was a really, really great conversation, and I think encapsulates what the Hyro stuff is all about. Quick mention too, for everyone watching, a great way to support the show is sending HBAR to the show's wallet, 0.0.1725506. This is how I get tokens from the community and sell them to pay for subscriptions for the show and the equipment and all these different types of things. I'm very blessed to not really have spent a ton of my own money to do the show. The show doesn't make a lot of money, but it doesn't need to. And I haven't really been asking for contributions for a little while. But now I'm opening it back up because I've got some exciting ideas for the show. The demand for the show is growing. So I need the resources to make it happen. So wallet 0.0.1725506. And also too, even if you don't have any HBAR, subscribe on follow me on X, YouTube. It's on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. All that kind of stuff is greatly, greatly, greatly appreciated for the show. So really appreciate it. Now, before we talk about the Asset Tokenization Studio, a quick apology that this is going to be a long show. I wasn't expecting so many crazy announcements on Monday. I'm hoping to have Greg stop by. Greg Scullard from Hashgraph to stop by on an episode maybe next week or something to talk about the Asset Tokenization Studio, because it's some big news. But that conversation with Richard was great, and I think that my key takeaway with all the Hyro Linux stuff is I do think that the ecosystem could be underestimating the significance of this announcement and this development. Long term, short term, like Richard said, there's still stuff to do. We've got to figure some stuff out. But long term, I think that we're definitely underestimating this. So I'm going to continue diving into the Project Hyro stuff. But yeah, I think the number one question for people was, how does this impact HBAR? HBAR doesn't change. It's the token for the Hedera network. Does this threaten Hedera's existence and competition, forking the network, blah, blah, blah. It's like, as we talked about with Richard, no, it's not about, do you have access to the code and can you copy Hedera? It's can you copy the almost decade of work done standing up an ecosystem? So that's not really a concern, I don't think. What does this do for the ecosystem? I think that a big, again, complaint and criticism that the ecosystem has had is we hear about the pipeline and enterprise is coming and it's taking forever. We got to be patient, this and that. And what we learned was this in particular, and because it's part of the Linux Foundation, now all the idea people and innovators at these massive corporations, they don't have as much resistance to using Hedera for their projects. So I think that overall, it's hard right now to see any kind of real negative or have any kind of really substantial concerns about this announcement. I think that really it's hard to see that kind of stuff. I think that I'm seeing a lot of positive coming from this. And like Richard said, it's a journey, that the ecosystem is still on. So to be